we're all different, every single one of us, from the way that we dress, to the way that we grew up, to the things that we believe in, to the things that we care about. All of us have our differences. Unfortunately, not everyone embraces us for those differences, and that's called being intolerant. And people can be intolerant of everything. Intolerant of your race, intolerant of your gender, your religion, your sexuality, your political party that you choose. Whether it's people being intolerant of what we believe or who we are, we've all experienced ignorance, we've all experienced intolerance. So everybody goes through those moments where they feel like they're not heard or they're not seen, and everybody's got a story. And so tell me a little bit about like your story of just tolerance and acceptance and sort of your high school journey.
Right off the bat, when I got into middle school, I knew that I was just different. I mean, everybody at some point feels that at some point that they're different, but I just felt really isolated and alienated. And then I discovered that that was part of who I was. I had concealed my sexuality for years because I was young and I really didn't know what I was doing. But in 8th grade, during something called Challenge Day, I came out to pretty much the entire student body. Because I just said, I gotta get up and this is something I have to do for myself. And I did it, and I was overwhelmed with how positive the response was.
How has feeling different or being different, like how does that play out in every day when you walk up and down the halls of a school?
You know, sometimes it can be a good thing to feel different because then you feel special, you really do feel worth it, and you feel like you can rise to the top of your own game. In other ways, it's a little hard because I think something that's really interesting specifically about being gay is you're never really done coming out. You may come out to your friends and your family, but you're just gonna have this assumption. People are just gonna have this assumption because it's normal in our society to be straight.
What do you think the root of intolerance is?
The root of intolerance is just ignorance. It's usually just, like I said, lacking information. It's just not wanting to be different, and it's not wanting others to be different. If you see something out of place, you just have the natural tendency to correct it. But you have to learn to celebrate that at the same time.
How do you typically respond to someone when they're being intolerant?
Just talk to them. You know, sometimes these people are afraid and sometimes these people are intolerant because they've grown up one way or they just truly don't know. So if they gain the knowledge, then they're less afraid, then they're less likely to be intolerant. So just maybe try and have a conversation and see where that goes.
Well, when I moved from Indonesia to US, obviously it was shocking. I had zero English. Like, I did not know how you say it, like ABC, if that makes sense. Like, we say it in different way. You know, we have alphabets, but it's not. We pronounce it differently. Having good grades was like everything for me. And when I first met my teacher, she gave me a textbook. She opened it for me, and then she just told me like, "Can you do this?" And I was like, I did not even know what it was saying. I think it was math, but I don't understand the direction. And so when I got my first homework assignment, it was a lot of readings and means I have to translate words by words, and it was a lot of struggle. Just trying to get schoolwork for me personally, it was just a slap in the face when someone used to be like, you know, top 10 kids, and then here I am crying over my homework. It's like, you know, it's ridiculous to me. I started wearing my scarf actually when I moved here, and my wearing the scarf was my own like choice. It was like my parents didn't say anything, but I didn't know what a huge deal it was then. When we would go out, you know, I was 12 years old, 12, 13, you know, and people just like look at you different, just like with the different looks and everything. And I never know that I should be like scared or like fear because of that, because I think that's not my fault. Like, you know, I didn't do it, so why should I deal with it in a way? But I was wrong. I'm brave myself enough to go to a high school when I'm still learning English myself, and then on top of that I have to go to different places and have to deal with like the stares that people give me and just the different looks. And then sometimes I would smile at them, say hi, whatever, and then they would just like give me a dirty look, and I can't do anything about it. And I'm right here, I'm just trying to be nice, I'm trying to like, you know, get in the society, I'm just trying to fit in. But then there are people there that do things like that that makes me feel like I don't belong. People judge just because I guess they got nothing better to do. Me, my religion, my community, you know, Muslims, it really has nothing to do with us. It's just simply these people with their own fears that don't want to get out of the bubble and like learn learn and ask questions. It's simple as that. Don't just assume things and then put it in your brain and like out of nowhere point fingers, because things like this hurt.
As you've heard, intolerance is everywhere. I think the question that we have to start to ask ourselves is, how do I become more accepting? How do I become more tolerant of the people around me? And as Putri said, it starts by asking questions. So I gathered a group of students from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds, and we had an honest conversation about our differences.
Yeah, I think the first time I've ever experienced anything severely, like just super uncomfortable with like intolerance, it was like, I think maybe my first couple of months like in college of just being like the only person of color in my class. So it was just really hard to like have discussions about racism and feel like somebody was backing me up or understood where I was coming from half the time.
I think when I was growing up, I was probably in the more intolerant group, I would say. Like, I'm probably guilty of it, honestly. Just growing up, I grew up in Texas in a mostly white conservative town, and just like people you kind of knew their background or something, and when they didn't fit in or when they were new in our church, we were just like, who is this person, and kind of like push them to the side and just kind of just hang out around each other and just push all the outsiders away.
And so you grew up in a place where it was like intolerant, right? Like there's a lot of just like lack of diversity and there's and a surplus of intolerance. So why do you think like there is so much of that?
It's hard because a lot of people, that I grew up with, it's almost just like a hive mind. You don't want to be different because you will be called out, I guess, in a way. And honestly, with a lot of the people I grew up with, that conversation, it doesn't go far.
How do you guys deal with a person who is just blatantly intolerant of you as either a white person, a Christian, an African American, a woman, whatever? Like, how do you deal with someone who's just blatantly intolerant of who you are as a person?
I try to at least create a form of empathy for that person, especially because like I don't know what kind of world they're living in.
So when there's intolerant behavior, well, I approach it head on, but I still block them out as a person. I approach it head on from an educational standpoint, but you as an individual right now, you're not gonna stop me from saying what I have to say and doing what I have to do.
How do you, as someone who obviously you aren't black, but you had friends who were, and you were maybe on like a side of fighting for equality and diversity and all that stuff, acceptance. Like how do you manage that conversation when you don't know what it's like?
It's hard because that kind of is the first part that I led with, when I would come back home or if I would talk to people that weren't in it. I'm not black. I don't understand the struggle, but as a white person, it's my duty to use my privilege to better the conversation or to start the conversation with some people. Some people haven't even had it. And so it's kind of like, if you can't take a second to step back and kind of wonder what you might do in that situation, just kind of like saying, try to understand rather than try to explain what you're seeing. Don't try to do that because you're not going to be able to.
When coming to the conversation of race between white Americans and people of color, that is a barrier that cannot be, it will never happen. You won't know why, because of its culture, the oppression that stems from people of color, and what creates these differences is essentially a part of our culture now. So when approaching that conversation, you have to approach it as a conversation, not as an argument, not as a political discussion, because I'm sorry, my life isn't politics.
Yeah.
So in the high school hallways, these conversations are common and these things get brought up in class. Like, what's the culture like and what's the conversation like that you see in the high school hallway, like on a typical day?
A typical day, it's majority, mostly big white kids. And you hear them like in the halls just cursing, not giving a care. The most bizarre thing is when I hear them saying the N-word and other people saying the N-word. In my opinion, yes, I am of that race, and I don't find it okay for me to say it myself. And kids are like, oh, well, I have a free card from my friend because they're black, so I can say it. That's not okay either.
So what I hear you saying is oftentimes we'll justify our intolerance. And a lot of people, when you get into a conversation about someone who well, that's intolerant or that's hypocritical, the first thing we do is justify why it's okay. So why is it so hard to listen?
It's it's just an instinct that like human beings have within amongst ourselves, that like if I scream louder than you, that means I'm right. But like the hardest part about listening, even with like my own self, of just like listening to you guys and understanding of just like maybe parts of me may disagree with you, but also to the fullest extent I agree with you because I love what you say, because we're actually having a conversation and a connection because we both want the same thing.
So is that the core of tolerance and acceptance then?
Yes.
Just to step out of your box and look back in.
Yeah.
And so for anybody watching this right now who's never stepped outside of their small rural town, or never stepped outside of their conservative group of friends, or has never had a conversation with a group of people who believes differently than they do, what's the first step into to doing that?
Get out.
But how? It's easy to say that, but if you're a 16-year-old kid, how do you do it?
Go to school, get educated, read everything you can, and start having conversations about
Talk
it
to people.
and develop who you are outside of it, even if it is against the grain, because at the end of the day, if you try to conform when you're really not happy, the people that are still doing it within that are still not happy either.
I'm not here to tell you what to think or how to believe, but it's obvious to me that our differences are the thing that divide us the most. It's things that we can't control. Things like our sexual orientation, our race, or our religion. Just because you grow up in a bubble and you believe what you believe, it doesn't mean that you're right. It doesn't mean that someone else is wrong. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's your job to try to convince people to think like you do. We grew up in one of the most diverse countries in the world. You should expect to meet people who think differently. You should expect to meet people who grew up differently. And you should celebrate that. You should embrace it. If you want your world to be more tolerant, if you want to become more accepting, you have to start asking questions because you want to learn, not because you want to persuade.